What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Way of X. But before we get into this, I want to clear a few things up. Yes, Jonathan Hickman is quote-unquote leaving Marvel, but not permanently. He's actually working on something different at Marvel. He's still contributing a little bit to the X-Men line. It's really more of like kind of operating on the back end as an organizational thing. And two, he is going to Substack along with like James Tynion and a whole bunch of other great big huge writers. Substack is basically an all-digital version of like Image Comics in effect. And Hickman is writing like 3 moons, 3 worlds, and they're all kind of building a shared universe together. So imagine if Image Comics was like Marvel Comics and then it was only digital, and that's basically Substack. Having said that, so the Way of X basically focuses on the return of Onslaught, right? It's one of the things we talked about in the last few videos, that Onslaught was coming back. But the way this is handled was really, really cool, right? So the overall gist here was that Onslaught, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with this, Onslaught's probably one of the most amazing villains that Marvel ever had in the history of the X-Men line. And he was insanely powerful, even in his base form, right? He's a combination of Professor X's frustration with humanity combined with Magneto's hatred of humanity on the psychological level that merged into a singular being, right? And then following that, he took the powers of X-Man Nate Gray, or at least absorbed X-Man Nate Gray, which just gave him insane telepathic and telekinetic powers, which were way beyond what he already had. And then he absorbed Franklin Richards when he was a little kid, which made him even more powerful because then he could alter reality, right? So this guy was an absolute hoss, right? If you want to know more about Onslaught, I believe we have a Beyond Omega level video on Onslaught. If we don't, I don't know why we wouldn't. That'll be down in the description. He's insanely powerful. But the overall gist here is that the hunt for Onslaught, or trying to figure out how Onslaught's coming back or why he's coming back or even when he's coming back, has really come down to Legion and Nightcrawler. And the reason for this is pretty simple and very elegant the way that it was handled. It was basically keeping it small, and Legion is probably one of the only mutants out there that could actually go toe-to-toe with Onslaught. Because one thing to keep in mind when it comes to David Haller, in his normal human form, right, is, I guess, you know, David Prime, if you want to call him that, he's already absurdly powerful in terms of his telepathy. But then when you add to the fact that he's got thousands of personalities in his head, each one has a power of their own, it makes him one of the most powerful mutants in existence. He can do anything from controlling people's emotions to altering reality. It's crazy the kind of stuff that he can do. But one of the things they're doing is keeping it small, because the reality is everybody knows that Onslaught originated from Magneto and Professor X. And under any normal circumstance, that wouldn't matter. But those guys are running Krakoa. And so if you found out that the psychic amalgamation of just frustration and rage is returning, and that it originated from the people who were running your country, you would probably flee. That's most likely what you would do. And so if everybody else found out that Onslaught was coming back, it would completely and totally destroy everything Krakoa stands for. And so while David and them aren't really doing it for any altruistic purpose, right? Like, we really want to spare Magneto and Xavier the humiliation of basically knowing that like their love child, their psychic love child is returning. It's really more to ensure that this nation of Krakoa does not collapse. Along this journey, there's a couple things that go on here. There's not really huge things, but a couple small things that go on here. The first thing is that you have a couple mutants named Mercury and Loa, and they are in effect not really losing control of their powers, but having a hard time coping with their powers. And for the most part, that's not a major plot thread, but the reason why you end up seeing Legion get involved here is because he's basically using them as bait. That if he can enter into their minds using his telepathy and then help them kind of better understand each other, their powers can work in unison, work closer, so on and so forth. It'll also give him the ability to fish out Onslaught, to see if Onslaught is among them or potentially anybody that they came into contact with. And it actually works, right? In the process, when he gets inside their minds, their kind of joined minds, that he ends up finding Onslaught and then rooting him out. Now, as soon as Onslaught realizes he's discovered, he takes off, right? He immediately bails and just jumps to the next person. Now, that's something that I do want to talk about here for a second. You wouldn't think that a being this powerful would run away, right? You wouldn't really think that would happen. Then instead, it would stand and it would challenge David. But that's one thing to keep in mind. The original Onslaught saga was exactly like that, right? When Onslaught first manifested, he hid inside the mind of Charles Xavier. Nobody really knew that he was there, right? His origin came from really the idea, or it really started with the Fatal Attraction story when Charles Xavier had shut down all of Magneto's powers after he basically ripped the adamantium out of Wolverine. And then when a mutant was killed just outside the Xavier Institute, that was the breaking point, right? And that's where when Xavier had shut down Magneto's powers, he had absorbed a portion of his consciousness in the process. And then when that little kid was killed, it all just came together, and then it basically, you know, resulted in Onslaught being born. And then he just hid. He just stayed as this kind of kernel inside the mind of Xavier, but appearing every once in a while. Just small little things, right? Creating dissent, creating discord among the ranks of not just the mutants in the X-Men Institute, but the overall mutant population. population until it was strong enough to be able to make it on its own, and then it showed up, right? And it really kind of happened when the X-Men realized what was going on. Something was wrong with Xavier, and when they confronted him, that's when Onslaught manifested, and then all hell broke loose, right? So that's kind of what is really going on here in a more broad scale. It's basically the essence of Onslaught just jumping from person to person. Now, following that, you kind of pick up with Nightcrawler here, who is following the events when he was drunk during the gala. Nightcrawler got drunk. A man of God was getting drunk on the sacrament. So the important thing here is that he ends up coming across Stacy X. Now, Stacy X is kind of a cool mutant. Her powers are really what make her cool, not her as a person, right? Her powers are awesome. So she's a lot like Rogue in the sense that her powers only really impact you if they touch you, but she can basically emit pheromones that can do everything from make you experience incredible sensations of love to literally crapping your pants, right? It depends on what it is that she wants to do with you. But come to find out, what Stacy X has been doing is running a place called the Bower, which is basically a brothel. There's a brothel inside of the nation of Krakoa, and it kind of makes sense, right? One of the things that's really happened when it came to Krakoa is we've only really seen the political / conflict side, right? On the home front, one of the things we learn here that makes perfect sense is there are mutants on Krakoa who, one, don't want to get with humans, right? Because, you know, it's kind of shunned. It's not really illegal within Krakoa, but it's kind of looked down upon, right? Like getting into a relationship with a normal human, because humans are largely kind of considered to be the enemy. And so there are a lot of mutants around here that aren't really looking for like a long-term romantic relationship. They just want to bang. And so you end up going to the Bower, right? And that's where everybody just basically hooks up. And that's essentially it. But the other part of this, and that's kind of the funny thing, is that when you have this kind of thing taking place, one of the things that's alluded to here is there isn't really any method of protection between these various mutants, right? And so this basically results in kids being born. And one of the darker elements here is that these kids are largely just kind of abandoned. They're left in this sort of hatchery, or this kind of place where, you know, the kids is really more like an orphanage than anything else. And that eventually they'll grow up, right? And they may or may not be adopted by other mutants, whatever the case is. They'll go on to become productive members of society. It's kind of messed up when you think about it, but one of the cool things about this is you actually end up finding out that there is a mutant named Lost that's basically a part of this. Now, Lost is a very new creation in Marvel Comics, right? Like literally created during the Way of X series. The way this worked is that Lost was at one point a mutant who just existed out there, but her parents were basically killed by Fabian Cortez and the Acolytes sometime before the events of, at least the events of the past. We don't really know when. We're not really given like the circumstance in terms of how it unfolded. We're just told that it did. So there's basically a big kind of vendetta between Lost and Fabian Cortez. But more so than that, Lost has the ability to distort gravity around her. And so that's why she hangs out here where the kids are, as opposed to with anybody else, because the effect of her powers basically gives people vertigo. And so they just end up getting nauseous, puking their guts up, and so nobody really hangs out with her. But when Fabian Cortez ends up showing up here on the scene, a fight kind of breaks out between the two of them. Now, under normal circumstances, this wouldn't happen. But again, Onslaught is influencing the people around here. And so when Onslaught had kind of taken off from Loa and Mercury, it had landed inside of Lost, and then David Haller and them basically managed to track Onslaught down. And then of course, Onslaught manifests itself for like a split second and basically sends everybody flying. And while no one really seems to understand exactly what was going on, Legion does. Legion and Nightcrawler know exactly what was happening, that Onslaught manifested for a split second, just sent everybody out of there, and then called it a day. So you end up picking up on basically Mars, which again is kind of a satellite place for the mutants to hang out, right? Kind of an extension of Krakoa. And it's really their own nation, right? Literally, like the mutant population is terraformed Mars. And now like there's a huge portion of them living there, or at least Storm is the one who governs it. But the big kind of discussion here is, what are we going to do about Onslaught, right? How is this going to work? Like, what are we going to do with this kind of massive threat here? And so you have this kind of brief reprieve where Legion returns to Krakoa and has a conversation with Charles Xavier. And this is when everything starts to pop off, right? Because as Xavier is talking to Legion, one of the things to keep in mind is they've always had a very contentious history with each other. A lot of it was because of it really goes back to the nature of David and the sense that as the child of Gabriel Haller and Charles Xavier, that Legion's powers were just wild, and it was very difficult to kind of corral these personalities or to even understand the nature of his powers. And so despite him not really having a desire to do so, at the end of the day, it was in the interest of everybody involved if Legion was basically subjected to experimentation at the hands of Xavier, Moira McTaggart, not really brutal experimentation, but to kind of understand his powers. More so than that, Legion was insane back in the day. So you started seeing things like the Legion quest, which led into the Age of Apocalypse, when Legion went back in time and intended to kill Magneto, and Xavier jumped in the way and died instead. And so it's one of these things where Legion has, in a lot of instances, caused more problems for the X-Men population than he has any real benefit. And so because of the contentious relationship between the two, there really isn't a whole lot of love loss here. I mean, there is to a degree, but really not a whole lot. And so ultimately, Xavier knows that like there's something going on out there, right? For some reason, there's heightened levels of rage and aggression among the X-Men population. And initially he thought that it possibly could have been Legion. Now, when David's like, no, that's ridiculous, it's not me, then Xavier realizes you do know who it is. And Legion's response is yes, but I'm not going to tell you. And so what ends up happening is that as he goes to leave, Xavier basically scans the mind of Legion and realizes the Onslaught entity has returned, which literally just annihilates the entire place, right? Just destroys everybody there. I mean, like within a span of a few seconds, the entire place just descends into just violence and destruction. Literally, Onslaught just drives everybody to kill each other. That's basically what happens. The resurrection protocols are enacted, and of course, people end up returning. Now, again, for their part, it is kind of bonkers here because the reality of Legion coming back, right? Xavier being killed in the process, literally everybody dying. The reality of this happening is a huge deal because even then, it seems as though Professor X still doesn't fully understand. And a lot of that's because, remember, when a mutant dies, they're brought back based on the most recent backup of their memory. And so essentially, Xavier's mind was not backed up after, or at least in that moment when he had realized what was going on with Onslaught. So when he comes back, he doesn't recall any of that, right? All he knows is like something happened and like 63 mutants were all killed in seemingly an instant, right? And that's when the question, when he asks like, you know, who did this, right? Who killed all these people? Then the answer is kind of like, that's kind of the thing, because it's believed that it was Legion. The belief is that Legion was the one who did it. And that's when Xavier goes to Mars, where Legion is really just kind of building up what is in effect a kind of battleground, a kind of arena for him to basically confront Onslaught by dragging him to Mars, basically, and the two of them facing off. When Xavier shows up here, that you end up having a kind of conversation between the two where Legion's not really paying any attention. Now, you do have the twin sons, Zorn and Zorn. Literally, like, one of them has a star in their head and the other one has a black hole. The important thing is if you were to destroy one, you'd probably wipe out the entirety of the Earth, right? That's kind of where their power is. But basically, like, Xavier's trying to talk to Legion and Legion's just ignoring him, right? He's kind of blowing him off the whole time. Now, for Nightcrawler, who Legion is actually talking to, he's basically dealing with a confrontation between Fabian Cortez and Lost, right? This is not really an overly important part of the comic. It's kind of cool, right? Because it's basically them having to come to terms with everything that's going on. Lost accepting the fact that Fabian Cortez is the one who killed her family and essentially having to learn to forgive him, and that Fabian Cortez coming to grips with the fact that he's basically hurt so many people and having to be able to beg for forgiveness. That's kind of what's going on with these two guys, right? The fight's pretty knockdown, drag out between the two, and you really have Nightcrawler in between who's trying to get everybody to understand what's going on and trying to get them to work together and so on and so forth. And so ultimately, he actually has this amazing moment where he teleports the two of them into the atmosphere, right? Into the stratosphere of Mars, if you can call it that. And then in turn, they just start falling down to the ground. Now, Fabian Cortez had shut down the powers of Lost, and basically they're all literally crashing to their deaths because Fabian Cortez, all he can do is boost or take away other people's powers. He can't really give himself powers, right? He can't give himself the ability to fly or anything like that. And so ultimately, he's like, Nightcrawler's like, here's what's gonna happen. I'm outside the sphere of influence of Fabian Cortez, so my powers are unaffected, but you guys are falling to your deaths. So either you can forgive and you guys can move on, or you can both crash into the ground and die and hold on to your hate forevermore. And ultimately, you have this instance where Fabian Cortez is kind of like, okay, cool. He basically realizes and accepts like how, you know, what it is that he's been doing over the course of his life, how he's been bringing harm to other people. And he basically starts trying to boost the powers of Lost. The problem is Onslaught's in them. And so ultimately Onslaught ends up pushing Fabian Cortez to not only boost the powers of Lost, but to do it to such a degree that he basically kills her, right? That she actually ends up dying. And so they kind of continue to crash down and so on. But the effect that she had, right? The boosting of her powers essentially anchored the moon of Mars. So Phobos is now crashing down into the planet. So they got like 10 minutes to evacuate. Onslaught literally created this kind of chain reaction that's going to lead to the destruction of this entire world. And so you have this really sort of cool moment here where you basically end up having Legion, who realizes how it is that Onslaught's coming back and how expansive the involvement of Onslaught is. And this is massive, right? So what Legion ends up figuring out here is that when Kurt basically ends up having his powers boosted by Fabian Cortez, so he can basically teleport to the moon and then teleport it away, right? Despite the fact that it's just a giant fireball at this point. What you also have is Legion revealing here that Onslaught kind of exists in the space between death and resurrection. That when a mutant out there is killed and they go through the resurrection process, not every element of them is brought back. That in fact, what Xavier and the Five have been doing is bringing back the best of that particular mutant, right? So say, for example, that you had somebody out there who was hell-bent on death and destruction. That if that mutant died, for whatever reason, maybe they had like a change of heart and they saved the X-Men from impending doom, and that person died in the process, they'd be worthy of resurrection. But when they were brought back, that little segment of them, that evil aspect of them, would be left out. Onslaught feeds on that. And so the result is that's why he's been getting more and more powerful. It's almost as if you have somebody eating a plate of food and they leave leftovers and just walk away. Onslaught's basically feeding on the leftovers, but the psychic leftovers of all these mutants who have been resurrected. And that's what's allowing him to become more and more powerful. So the reality is his return doesn't really seem to be anchored directly to Charles Xavier or Magneto. It basically seems as though he's kind of returning of his own accord, right? And it makes sense because those psychic elements of Xavier and Magneto still exist. The entirety of Krakoa is rooted in frustration and hatred for humanity, right? The entire basis behind this nation's existence is because the mutant population doesn't trust humans. And so because of this, they're kind of out doing their own thing. And so it makes perfect sense that Onslaught would eventually return, even if only through that particular method. Now, the other part of this is that Nightcrawler knows that when he's resurrected, that he's not going to remember any of this. And so he tells Fabian Cortez, when the time comes when I'm brought back, remind me of like this anchor, remind me of this demon being, remind me of this, like give me this one particular phrase, and everything will start to return, right? Everything will come back to me, and in turn, I will fully understand what's going on, right? He calls it the spark, right? Like tell me about the spark. And basically that will recall or kind of jog those memories in Nightcrawler and remind him to go after David Haller to have David Haller fill him in on everything. And so of course, Nightcrawler is able to basically teleport Phobos away, which is absolutely amazing, right? That's kind of the crazy thing. And then this is one of those interesting moments when Fabian Cortez boosts the powers of Nightcrawler. Nightcrawler sees it all, right? He's like, I see everything. I see how we win. I see how we flourish. I see the path, the way. So seemingly it's like he can see his own past. He can see it all coming together in a singular picture, but it also seems like there's a bit of precognition that goes on there. Now, this is where things are a little weird. I'm really just kind of haphazard guessing here because this is how you end up having these small little moments where a mutant gets elevated from being just like an alpha level or gamma level mutant, possibly even a beta level mutant, to becoming an omega level mutant. I don't really know how you elevate somebody like Nightcrawler from being the level that he is now to omega level, because literally he just teleports through the brimstone dimension to another location and that's it, right? So maybe you can increase how much mass he can teleport or something like that. Teleporting an entire moon is a big deal, but at the very least, the most he could do is become somebody like Manifold who could teleport people through like space and time, right? Or possibly to other dimensions. And that would be the extent of it. And I don't know if really teleporting somebody across space and time would make somebody omega level. Marvel could change that and say that's the case, who knows? But of course, he ends up dying, because of everything going on, right? I mean, basically sacrificing his life, being burned alive, what little life he has left, he's kind of being snuffed out as he's in like the coldness of space and so on, but he ends up coming back. Now, the question he immediately asks is, where's Fabian Cortez, right? What's going on with Fabian Cortez? The problem, and we're not really given a definitive explanation here, Fabian Cortez is in a catatonic state. We don't know how he got there. We simply just know that he is, right? Now, it may very well be that Onslaught had a hand in this, that Onslaught had screwed up the mind of Fabian Cortez. It could be that Charles Xavier was the one who did it, and seemingly that might entirely be the case, that Charles Xavier is the one who screwed up the mind of Fabian Cortez. And that would kind of make sense, because if Onslaught is in the mind of Charles Xavier and is full on taken over Charles, even if Charles doesn't fully know, right? So he exists in like his subconscious, then he would in turn wipe the mind of Fabian Cortez, just leave him there. And when Fabian is brought back, he's not going to remember anything about what Nightcrawler told him, remind me of the spark and so on and so forth. He's not going to remember any of that stuff. So it's going to fall on Nightcrawler to seek out Legion if he even remembers to do that. But at the moment, there's no real explanation here in terms of what happened. What we do know is that Onslaught is alive and well among everybody. And in fact, it even looks like he's in Charles Xavier and every single mutant on Krakoa. And so what this does is this continues on. It basically ends Way of X as far as I'm aware. I'm not aware of there being like a continuation of the Way of X. I think it was designed to be a miniseries. I don't think it's an ongoing series, but basically it goes into the Onslaught revelation, seemingly where Onslaught will full on return. But this is how Onslaught's rising, right? This is how Onslaught has been returning in Marvel Comics. And I'm excited for it, man. I'm excited for Onslaught coming back. Because let me tell you something, man. Let me tell you something. Onslaught is legit. I love Onslaught so much. He's just unbridled, just rage, frustration, and power, right? This guy is just, it's crazy how powerful he is. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace.